heritage site. Today we have Ms Taruna, who would be delivering her talk on climate vulnerability index, but we also have the two main people who were instrumental in developing this. And the first person is John Day. He has been also associated with Wildlife Institute of India for a very long time and also been instrumental in developing the management effectiveness evaluation methodology for India. And he basically commenced his professional career in Australian national parks, and he joined the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the federal agency responsible for Great Barrier Reef. And then subsequently, for about 28 years, he was in many aspects of planning and managing the Great Barrier Reef. As the director, John was responsible for biodiversity conservation, park planning, heritage, particularly World Heritage, Indigenous Partnership, and he was awarded the PSN and commencing the first 5 yearly quarterly outlook report. He subsequently retired in 2014 to undertake a post-career PhD at the Center in the Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University. The Climate Vulnerability Index was co-developed with John, and it is increasingly being applied globally, particularly in the World Heritage properties. And we also have Scott, who co-developed it, and a brief background on Scott is that he is an associate professor in physics at James Cook University and was affiliated to NOAA, Coral Reef Watch. His research has focused on coral and near-shore environmental physics through satellite, coastal, and in-water remote sensing. So, of key interest in synthesis of physical data with biological and chemical information to improve the understanding of ecosystem impacts. And Scott is also here for all kinds of questions that we may have with respect to the Climate Vulnerability Index. And before we proceed to Taruna, I would ask John to briefly give his opening remarks, followed by Scott. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Dr. Gautam. I'll actually ask Scott to kick off and then I'll come in after him.
Okay.
Thank you very much, John. I come to you from Townsville in North Queensland, Australia, from the city campus of James Cook University, where I have been meeting with some of John's successors at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, working in response to this year's coral bleaching event. Firstly, I'd like to begin by thanking the Wildlife Institute of India and the C2C for hosting this webinar, and also for hosting Taruna Venkatachalam, from whom you'll hear very shortly, who is a valued member of our CVI team. And by way of introductory comments, I wanted to speak to why we developed this Climate Vulnerability Index. In essence, it was very clear that climate change is impacting the values and attributes of World Heritage properties all around the globe, but there was no tool in response that understood the nuances of the World Heritage system, as well as providing a systematic evaluation of climate vulnerability for heritage. So in response to that, John and I together acted upon this gap in our assessment methodologies and developed what we called the Climate Vulnerability Index. And we understand that there is another Climate Vulnerability Index that has been implemented at a very fine scale in various regions across India. And we're delighted to hear that. One clear distinction that we have is that whilst both of these methodologies apply the same IPCC-based framework for vulnerability, considering exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, one thing that we do in the World Heritage Climate Vulnerability Index assessment is to look not only at the values on which the property is inscribed, not only at the science, the climate science that underpins the future potential impacts, but we also consider the community. And we do an assessment of the vulnerability of the community if there were to be a decline in the World Heritage values. And so with that introduction there, I'd like to pass over to John, who will speak about some of the applications and the learnings that we've had through our history of this World Heritage CVI. John.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Dr. Gautam, for the introduction. As Scott said, the CVI is now being widely applied in both natural and cultural World Heritage properties. So we've initially applied it in a small place called Heart of Neolithic Orkney in Scotland, and we also initially applied it in a very large natural site called Shark Bay in Western Australia. So we've been able to prove that the tool does apply in a wide range. We've now applied it in urban situations like the old and new towns of Edinburgh, right through to remote oceanic islands like Aldabra Atoll. We've applied it in cultural landscapes ranging from in the middle of Africa, a place called Sakura Cultural Landscape, right through to Vega Archipelago in the remote part of Norway up near the Arctic Circle. We've also applied it in different ways. We've now applied it for transboundary sites, serial sites, and we've recently applied it in its first use for a World Heritage nomination, an area that's about to be nominated for World Heritage, and they wanted to see upfront what the climate impacts. We've also now taken it through to an Indigenous Australian group, so it's not a World Heritage site, but they've applied the same framework. So Scott and I are pretty confident that the framework we've developed is widely applicable. It's not just our view. We've also been endorsed, for example, by the agency called Historic Environment Scotland. They're probably the most advanced cultural managers when it comes to climate change in the world. And they've asked us to apply the CVI to all their World Heritage properties. And we're doing that systematically. We've done about half and we're continuing on this year. So that's a nice endorsement. So I'll leave it there, but I do want to stress the CVI is a rapid assessment. It's not a deep dive, but it does allow us to look at a wide range of both natural and cultural properties. And we've been able to prove that so far. So thank you, Dr. Gautam. I'll pass it over to you, and then Scott and I will hang around at the end if there are any questions that Taruna is not able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Scott. I now introduce you to Taruna. Taruna Venkatachalam completed her bachelor's from University of Mumbai, and then she graduated in MSc in Tropical Biology and Conservation with distinction from James Cook University, Australia, and is currently based in Townsville. She currently works as a research assistant for Climate Vulnerability Index in the World Heritage at James Cook University with an interest in socio-ecological sciences, community-based conservation, and GIS-based approaches for answering and visualizing conservation issues. So over to you, Taruna.
Thank you, Dr. Gautam, and welcome Scott and John and all the other participants of the meeting today. Thanks for attending the webinar. I'm just going to share my screen and let me know if you can see this. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So just starting off, I'm here, as we know by now, to talk about the CVI, or the Climate Vulnerability Index, which is a rapid systematic tool to assess climate change risk to heritage properties. My name is Taruna. As Dr. Gautam introduced, I'm a research assistant for the CVI project, and John and Scott are the developers, as you heard them talk earlier. Not sure why this is not working. Sorry, I will share again. Yeah. So one of the justifications, as Scott talked about, for the CVI, multiple international organizations associated with heritage have identified climate change being the fastest growing threat and the most significant current and potential threat to world heritage, and therefore posing a threat to the loss of world heritage and its values globally. So that required a tool for rapid assessment of vulnerability of heritage. The tool needed to be systematic, but not too complex. It needed to be applicable to all types of World Heritage properties, natural, cultural, as well as mixed. And as the CVI has also been exploring application outside of heritage to other protected or non-protected areas. The tool needed to be proactive, meaning it needed to act before the climate impacts could occur. And it puts climate impacts into context by acknowledging that there are other threats affecting these World Heritage sites. And this gave rise to the CVI. The CVI is a values-based, science-driven, and community-focused tool. And I'll go into detail about this in a bit, but very briefly, values-based refers to World Heritage values. Science-driven, it uses climate and societal data, and it is conducted in a participatory process. So as I explain these three aspects, we'll get an idea of what the CVI process is. There might be many aspects to understand, but please bear with me and just take it one step at a time. So first aspect is values-based. First, we identify the World Heritage values. It's one of the first steps in the CVI. We determine the key World Heritage values from the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value. So for those who are not familiar, the SOUV is a document that's drafted for all World Heritage properties, for each World Heritage property at the time of their nomination. As I said, we're also exploring non-World Heritage applications of the CVI. So for those properties, the key values would be derived from any of the documented basis for the site protection. Then the other thing that the CVI does is it incorporates significant property values. And these are values that are important to the property, but are not listed in any of these documentations. I'll just keep this slide up for a few seconds, but this is an example of the determination of key values for the Shark Bay World Heritage property in Western Australia. So we come to the next aspect, science-driven.
I don't know, you know him, madam.
We come to the next aspect called science-driven. The CVI is based on the IPCC vulnerability approach. For those who are not familiar, this framework uses an assessment of exposure and sensitivity combined to give a potential impact, and combine that with the adaptive capacity to deal with these climate stressors to give you vulnerability. But the CVI differs slightly from this. The first step of the CVI is to assess the OUV vulnerability. It remains, the framework remains pretty much similar to the IPCC approach. And this assessment is assessment of climate stressors upon the natural or cultural values of the property. But in the second part of the CVI, we assess community vulnerability. This uses assessment of economic, social, and cultural dependency, as well as adaptive capacity of the community associated with the property. We apply some modifiers to some of the aspects of the assessments of this CVI tool, and this process altogether makes up the CVI framework. So after assessment of the key values, sorry, we have disturbance, but anyway, one aspect of the after we complete assessment of the key values, you also assess key climate stressors associated with natural and cultural heritage. And these 15 stressors that you see on the screen are also derived from the IPCC. Some of these stressors are chronic, which means they're gradual, they take place over long periods of time, and some of them are acute, or take place over short periods. They're intense stressors. And on the bottom of the table, you'll see a section called context specific. Sorry, I just need to, yeah, thank you. So context specific stressors is an accommodation to allow for stressors that are specific to the site and are not common or not included in the rest of the table. So again, a short explanation of what chronic impacts are. They occur over many years or decades, for example, retreating glaciers in Canada or sea level rise. I'll just wait till this person can be removed.
Also,
While acute impacts are intense events that occur in very short periods of time, such as coastal flooding or hurricanes or storms. And thirdly, we have unprecedented impacts, which, as I said, which would go into the bottom of the screen. Okay, moving on. So I'll go into details of the assessments of OUV vulnerability. If you're confused about which step of the way we are at, you can just refer to the little box in the top right corner. So the first assessment is exposure, which is basically the likelihood of the site being exposed to the climate stressors. So you have a scale from level 1 to level 5 of being very unlikely to very likely. To this, we also apply modifiers of temporal scale and trend. Then we have an assessment of sensitivity, which is an assessment of, even if these climate impacts occur to the site, how likely is it that there will be a loss of World Heritage values? And to this, we include modifiers of spatial scale and compounding factors. Then we come to the third aspect, which is adaptive capacity, which we assess in two ways. The local management capacity, which is resources, funding, budget, knowledge that the management has to respond at a local level to the climate stressors, as well as scientific and technical support available to them. And in addition to this, you have these adaptive capacities, but how effective are they to actually address the climate change drivers? So that makes up the OUV assessments. Moving on to community-based. We covered values-based, we covered science-driven, and now we cover community-focused. And this is an assessment of the economic, social, and cultural connections. Economic refers to the business types that are associated with the property directly. These might be, for example, for the Shark Bay World Heritage Site, we had some business types which were fishing, we had mining, governmental, non-governmental organizations, and we had research and education. The second aspect is social, which are domestic, local, or international visitors, people who directly interact with the site. And cultural are all kinds of people who might have any kind of cultural connection, either indigenous or non-indigenous with the property. So for these ESC components, we assess two things. First is ESC dependency, which is the future effect of the key climate stressors on the ESC components. And these could be negative or positive. While adaptive capacity is the ability of the community to adapt now in the face of key climate stressors if they were to occur at the current time. And this can only be positive. Just going into a little bit of detail between the difference between social and cultural, it might be easier to think of social as interactions while cultural are identities. So for example, you might think of social interactions as how members of the community interact with the natural environment. While cultural identity is anyone who has a pride or attachment to the location, even if they may not have visited the property. Another important part of the CVI process, the whole process is conducted in a workshop-based approach. And personally, in my experience of the CVI, I think this is the most interesting and most fascinating part to observe these discussions and interactions. These workshops are conducted in facilitated informed discussion sessions. They are, as the CVI is meant to be, a rapid approach. So within 2.5 to 4 days, your workshops are completed. And this time frame depends on various factors, whether it's being conducted online or in person, as you can see in the photos on the left side. Whether it is a full workshop, which is conducted over several days with many stakeholders, multiple participants. Whether it's a CVI consult, which is in 1 day with fewer participants, or if it's a snapshot conducted in a few hours. Like I said, there are many stakeholders that are present at these workshops. You have people from community members to policymakers, governmental, non-governmental organizations, climate specialists, scientists. For cultural sites, you might have people like architects, archaeologists. For natural sites, you might have ecologists, environmentalists. So there's multiple people in the room who are contributing their multiple varied perspectives to the CVI assessment. And this gives rise to invaluable networking and knowledge sharing. There are people in the room, for example, when the CVI is applied to a very rural site where the people may not have direct access to, they might not be interacting with these policymakers directly. They're able to get access to the latest climate science or the climate data for their area. They're able to, put forward their experience of climate impacts in the area. And in turn, people like the policymakers and the top-down officials, the scientists are able to understand the on-ground impacts. So all of these various aspects of the CVI are linked using a very simple risk matrix approach. It might be easier to follow the colors. Here you have modified exposure combined with the modified sensitivity to give you a potential impact, which is then in turn combined with adaptive capacity to give you a traffic light assessment of OUV vulnerability. This OUV vulnerability then combines with ESC dependency, which is economic, social, and cultural dependency, the first aspect of the community vulnerability assessment. Then combined with adaptive capacity and the potential impact to give you community vulnerability. So how do all of these things that we've just seen actually fit into an actual CVI workshop application? First, we identify the key values prior to the workshop, and then we also assess the current condition and recent trend of these key values. In the group and outside as well, we agree upon the time frame and climate scenarios that will be considered when we're actually applying the CVI. Whether these impacts will be considered for a short time frame, whether we're thinking of 2030, a medium time frame of perhaps 2050, or a long time frame of maybe 2100. climate scenarios refers to greenhouse gas emission scenarios, whether we're going to be looking at the business as usual, as in we're going to follow the trend that we currently see in today's times, or whether we're going to be seeing lower emission scenario or higher. Then we assess the top 3 climate stressors. This is initially done for each key value. We assess 3 key climate stressors for each key value, and then we combine that or tally that for the whole property to get 3 key climate stressors for the whole property. Then you assess exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity to give you OUV vulnerability. And then you assess ESC dependency and adaptive capacity to get community vulnerability. And that makes up the whole CVI workshop. This is an example of a CVI application at the heart of Neolithic Orkney Cultural World Heritage Site in Scotland. As you can see, the site is made up of a few rock structures. It is a coastal site. And the assessments for this site were as follows. The time frame that was decided for this property was to 2050. The key climate stressors identified for this site was sea level change, precipitation change, and storm intensity and frequency. Now we can go on to the assessments. First, you assess exposure. You apply the modifiers to get you modified exposure for each key climate stressor. Then you assess sensitivity, apply the modifiers to give you an assessment of sensitivity for each key climate stressor. You combine those to give you a potential impact for each key climate stressor. And for this site, potential impact was found to be extreme. You combine the potential impact along with the adaptive capacity to give you OUV vulnerability, which is then combined for the whole property for all 3 key climate stressors. And for this property, the combined OUV vulnerability is high. Then you go on to cultural. In the similar way, you assess ESC dependency. As I said, dependency can go either positive or negative. So in this case, it was assessed to be moderate negative. You combine that with the OUV vulnerability here to give you ESC potential impact. Again, you assess adaptive capacity and to give you community vulnerability. For this site, it was determined to be moderate. There have been some improvements in the CVI methodology since it was initially published. The process of identifying the key values from the SOUV has been refined, as well as the process of identifying the current condition and recent trend. There is a lot more importance given to significant property values, or the values that are important to the property but not listed on the documentation. The table of key climate stressors, the 15 key climate stressors, has been refined and revised based on recent information from the IPCC. The process of how the ESC components is assessed has improved and developed. And over the last couple of years, we've had to apply the CVI in an online delivery framework, as most of us have had to work from home. So that process of an online workshop process has also been refined. So it's important to understand that the CVI is meant to be a high-level assessment, considering only the key climate stressors. The CVI examines the property as a whole, and it is meant to be a directional tool to point to knowledge gaps and areas that require more investigation. And it raises awareness about climate issues to these World Heritage properties. But it's also equally important to acknowledge what it doesn't do. It's not meant to be a detailed deep dive analysis. It is not meant to evaluate all the climate stressors, only the top 3 key climate stressors. It does not undertake detailed analysis of every individual element of the World Heritage property. It extracts the key values from the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value and uses those. It does not delve into new research areas, but it utilizes the latest scientific information, and it does not claim to provide all the solutions. These are all the CVI applications up to date. As you can see, it's been applied to a wide range of natural as well as cultural properties of varying sizes. You have Heart of Neolithic Orkney at one end, which is a very small site, and you have Shark Bay at the other end, which is over 2 million hectares. The site which is in dotted lines is the site which is still on the nominated list. It is not a complete World Heritage Site. I think John mentioned this at the beginning of the talk. So these are the sites and the three key climate stressors that have been identified for each of the CVI applications to date. I'll go over this fairly quickly. You have Shark Bay, which has 2 temperature stressors and 1 wind and storm. Shark Bay is a site in Western Australia. You have Wadden Sea, which is a transnational site, but this is a part of Germany, Netherlands, and Denmark. And again, you have 2 temperature stressors and 1 coastal. You have Heart of Neolithic Orkney in Scotland, which has 1 water cycle stressor, 1 wind and storm, and 1 coastal stressor. Edinburgh, also in Scotland, has 1 chronic temperature stressor, 1 chronic water cycle stressor, and 1 acute wind and storm stressor. Sukur is one of the 2 CVI Africa applications that we have done, is in Nigeria. Again, you have 1 temperature, 1 water cycle, which is a new stressor as compared to the previous applications of drought. You have Kilwa, which is another site in Africa, and you have High Coast Kavaken, which is in Sweden. So coming to some of the CVI's latest applications and the latest projects that we've been undertaking. Last year, we had a CVI Africa project, which was undertaken to assess the utility of the CVI to cultural World Heritage in Africa. And this was a big collaboration. There were a lot of participants. We had collaborations with people from Africa, ICOMOS, Nigeria, people in abroad as well. And it resulted in 2 cultural applications, as I said earlier. One was Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania, and one was a Sukur cultural landscape in Nigeria. And if you would like to read more about this, you can go to CVI. You can just follow the link at the bottom. CVI has been exploring thematic aspects in its framework for a while now. And this month, actually, we recently published an assessment of a thematic methodology to basically divide World Heritage properties by the common or the shared values and attributes that they contain. And this thematic approach, we expect to have implications in strategic networking and partnerships with site managers, perhaps, who are site managers for sites that have common thematic groups. And I'll be talking about this in relation to our aims in India as well. So this brings me to our aims in this Indian subcontinent. These are very broad. First and foremost, we would just like people to know that there is a tool called CVI that exists. It is recognized that there is an urgent need for rapid climate assessment to effectively assess for threats management. And the more people know about this tool, the more CVI applications that can take place. This is one of the main reasons that we're doing this webinar, is to network and knowledge share. We have the CVI tool and the framework, and you have knowledge of the area, the sites that require priority, a good location for a CVI application. And in this case, good location might be a site for whom, it has a lot of climate threats. It is known to have a lot of climate threats. It could be a site which is a good or a poor example of management of these threats. Or it could be a location about which nothing is known. And so the CVI can help understand more about that site. And additionally, with this networking, we're also in the process identify potential CVI workshop participants. And like I said earlier, the CVI has been exploring application to non-heritage sites. This has not been completed so far, but it's definitely something that's being explored, and there is a lot of scope for discussion for this. And thirdly, like I said earlier, we would like to apply our novel thematic methodology perhaps to sites in the Indian region. Given the skewed ratio towards cultural World Heritage sites, we might explore a cultural thematic methodology. But again, there is a lot of scope for discussion for this. And if the need of the hour is found that we would prefer to do a natural thematic analysis, that the discussion might go that way as well. So very briefly, this is the CVI update newsletter. And if you would like to know more, you might have indicated your interest in the registration form as well, or you can find them on the CVI Heritage link at the bottom. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to WII as well for hosting this. And yeah, I'll just hand it over to any questions, if any. Thank you.
So, Taruna, I think, thank you for your presentation. I see a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll go ahead and present them one to you. One question which has come up right now is the applicability of CVI in mixed heritage sites, because I guess the context is there are different values, and as you had mentioned earlier, the thematic factors might be completely different for cultural and natural sites. So in the case of mixed site, how do you go about it? That is one question. And another question which came up through a colleague is with regards to the refinement point which you made, that over a period of time, CVI process has been refined, and you have come up with better ways of developing values of the property. So my question essentially was whether the values, was it in the context of a particular example, or was it like an overall trend which you noticed, and what was that refinement which you introduced in the process of determining value? I would, if John or Scott wants to jump in as well after you, they could continue the discussion.
Yes, I'll just respond to the first question in the chat, which is there a scope for CVI to be applied to mixed heritage? Yes, I would say, because it has been applied to natural, it has been applied to cultural, and the framework remains the same. But the only difference that I see coming in would be, the participants in the CVI workshop would be more varied. That's the only adjustment I would see to the CVI process for a mixed heritage application. But it is in its entirety, it is completely applicable to mixed heritage sites. And for your second question regarding, I'll just go to that slide actually. Sorry, I'm just struggling with this a little bit. We're talking about the improvements in the CVI methodology, am I right? I think with this aspect, I might pass this over to John, who might be a better candidate for explaining the difference in the application, the identification of key values. John, you're muted. John, you're muted.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about John. I was trying to unmute you and then I muted you instead. Sorry.
No problem. So yes, as Taruna said, and when we started the CVI process, we recognised the key values were foundational, and we identified those from the statement. But as we've done a series of workshops and worked with various World Heritage managers, we've just improved the way we identify those key values. And we also then take it to a second step where we identify attributes associated with those key values. So it's not rocket science, it's fairly basic, but what we've learned, as I said, is a very effective process for the managers to recognise and to identify the key values based on their statement. And then, as Taruna mentioned in her talk, we use those key values to then assess the current condition and recent trend of the property. This is a really important foundational part for a CVI process, but it also gives the managers a very important benchmark. Because it's a rapid assessment, they can come back and use the same process down the track and see whether the current condition has improved based on their adaptive management. So I stress, it ain't rocket science what we've developed. It is based on previous work that I know you've been using in the C2C there to look at overall values, but I think we've improved even more since I published some of that earlier work. Thank you.
Yeah. And I see Scott has raised hand as well. Scott, if you want to jump in.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to expand upon the question about the mixed World Heritage properties, simply to note that we have seen this as perhaps the one gap in our analysis, our gap analysis of a property that we have not yet applied the CVI in, and we are intending to have an application in a mixed World Heritage property this September. And so that will be indeed a testing case for the application in a mixed World Heritage property. However, in all of the applications that we've had to date, there has been a combination of aspects of nature and aspects of culture. Cultural World Heritage properties are typically located in a natural setting. Natural World Heritage properties are recognised because of their importance to the community and the global community. So there is inherently within each of these an aspect of cultural heritage and natural heritage for all sites, even if they aren't recognised by the World Heritage process in that way. And if I can give you one example, the Great Barrier Reef is recognised under all 4 natural World Heritage criteria, but it also has a very strong cultural connection, both with the indigenous population, the traditional owners of the land and sea country around the Great Barrier Reef, as well as with the more recent cultural connections with Australians and beyond. Thank you very much.
I might address the next question.
Yeah, sorry, Taruna?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's another question in the chat which relates to the effects of CVI and policy. John, as you mentioned that Australia is a place where you have been working a lot, and especially for countries with a lot of World Heritage sites, do you anticipate or have you already seen examples of the CVI process affecting policy of how the sites are managed, you know, in terms of thematic mapping and grouping, and any other comments on that? This is open to all 3 of you, Taruna, Scott, and John. Thank you.
I'll kick off, and then I'm sure Scott and Taruna might come in after. In terms of policy, I think the best example I can give of that is our colleagues in Scotland. As I said, the agency called Historic Environment Scotland recognised that the CVI gave them really important information that could feed into their management planning process. They do their management planning on a 5-year cycle, and they have done the first lot of CVIs for some of their properties, not all, as I said, but they've already come back to us saying they want to bring the CVI into a similar cycle, so they do it as a rapid assessment, and then it can update their management planning. They recognise that as managers, they can't do everything they want to do. They want to prioritise, and they see the CVI as helping give them guidance in terms of management direction. So that's, I think, a good example of how it's impacting policy. Scott, do you want to add to that?
I think just building on there and echoing some of John's comments with respect to strategic actions that can be undertaken, having a documentation of those is a really helpful thing to be able to point to. So in our CVI applications, we produce a report that summarizes not only the findings of the process, but also identifies the knowledge gaps, the research opportunities, and the policy needs that are required, in addition to pointing to specific strategies that should be investigated. And as John mentioned, our partnership with Historic Environment Scotland has been very fruitful in terms of the uptake of these outcomes into the management plans that are developed for those World Heritage properties. And that's not the only outcome. I just point to that simply as an exemplar from multiple applications.
I'll just add to that, like Scott said, in my personal experience of the CVI, I think as I also said in discussions I've had with people here, I think that the notebook of notes that people take away from the CVI workshops, you know, the adaptive capacities and the issues that are going on, that, you know, everyone takes away, the community members, for example, ICOMOS and any governmental, non-governmental institute representatives. I think that notebook and the parking lot that we have, I think those are the most important aspects of the CVI in my experience.
Thank you everyone for the answer. And Scott, your hand is still raised. Do you have something else to add?
Yes, I just wanted to initiate a response to another of the queries regarding what have we done in India? And the answer is we're here right now and we're very interested to connect in. And so whilst I can say we're here right now, that is in the person of Taruna, who is in India at the moment. John and I demonstrating our interest by joining in on this webinar from this afternoon over here in Australia, and recognizing the opportunity to work together and the importance of assessing climate vulnerability, which is also illustrated in the question itself. So I just wanted to quickly reply there and say that's exactly why we're engaging in this way.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I see a lot of questions in the chat. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we will be able to take up just one more. For those of you on the WI campus, Taruna is with us here on campus. So you can feel free to stop by at the C2C office and meet her in person, discuss, take up your topics of discussion further. One question which has come up in the chat, this goes out to all three of you again, is how do you see the applicability of CVI to places beyond World Heritage? You know, like places which have heritage but not exactly World Heritage. So how do you extend that applicability? I think on the chat they particularly mentioned marine protected areas which might not be World Heritage sites, but there's a lot of community engagement required and potentially a lot of interaction required. So can we extend the process or have some comments on how it can be adapted for such scenarios? I hope I captured the question correct. And thank you.
And I'm going to leave this question to Scott and John because I had a conversation with Dr. Pandey on this.
Well, thank you. I'll jump in there. The beginning point of our analysis is the descriptive document for this protected area. For World Heritage, as Taruna mentioned, it's the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value. Typically, protected areas have some kind of foundational document that outlines why that location should become a protected area. And so when we have looked at applications of the CVI process in non-World Heritage places, and some of this discussion has been in Australia and in the UK, we begin with the foundational document constitutes in of outstanding universal value. From that point, we're able to build on in a very similar way, following the same process, starting with a different foundational point,
I think, Scott, your connection might be a bit.
I think there might be an issue.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I might try and jump in over Scott, because yes, his is breaking up. One of the points that the person in the chat question asked was the engagement with fisheries and other stakeholders. And I think this is an important part of the CVI methodology. When we've done the CVI in a snapshot approach, just with the managers, it's pretty clear that managers of a property have a view which is based on their time they've been associated with the property. In some cases, managers may have only been there for a very short time. When you bring in the wider community, you generally get a much longer term perspective. So it's useful to have both. The managers know their property well, but you'll often find that community representatives, whether they're fishers or tourist operators, they're out there every day as well, sometimes more often than the managers. And they can see changes that are occurring day to day. And if they've lived in the community their whole life, they can bring a perspective to the assessment that a manager who might have only been there 5 or maybe 10 years perhaps doesn't have. So the bottom line is the community vulnerability aspect we think is a really important part for raising awareness in the community, but bringing in the community knowledge into the overall vulnerability assessment. So yes, there are modifications needed to the CVI process to look at non-World Heritage sites, but it's basically the same overall process. It uses the same overall framework, the same approach, but it's done in a more general way. And that's the flexibility. Whilst we're following a systematic framework, we've shown that it can be adapted and modified when we've applied it in different locations around the world.
Well, thank you, John. I think the person who raised the question, Mr. Anand Pandey, has something to add on. Anand, if you can, yes, I'll try and unmute you. Hold on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Anand.
Yeah, hi. Sorry. So thanks, Taruna, and thanks, Dr. John Day, and thanks, Ranjan. So I just had to add for you what you answered. I just wanted a query on that. I had a query on that. So basically, this process is when you talk about the Indian scenario, I'm talking specifically about Indian sites. If you extend this CVI processes to areas beyond World Heritage sites in India, then you come in and you bring in a lot of sites which have a lot of biodiversity value and ecological value, as well as cultural value to the local communities. So in that way, incorporating CVI processes would require, I think, more deliberations and longer deliberations with the communities, and maybe this consultative process has to be a little elaborate compared to the already established ones. So my question was actually, like, how do you see that? What kind of changes, maybe not very major changes in the entire process, but if there are any minor changes that you foresee in terms of applying CVI to areas beyond World Heritage sites or in protected areas in India? Am I clear with the question?
I think so. I'll start off, and I'm sure the others will join in behind me. So yes, we have taken the CVI process and looked at it, applying it elsewhere, but I have to say, haven't done a lot of it. So we're still developing that. But you're absolutely right. We're not saying one size fits everyone. So you have to be adaptable in the way you apply it. And it may well be, as you said, that, say, for example, with an Indigenous population, they like to think about it and come back at a later stage with their response. So at the moment, we've done a very rapid approach, but the overall methodology, I think, has the potential to be, modified depending on the situation. Now, that might mean several workshops over a longer period. It might mean more engagement by the people on the ground. At the moment, the way the CVI is set up is that Scott and I are the sort of workshop facilitators, but we work closely with the on-site managers. Most of the managers are learning about the CVI, but they haven't yet got to the stage where they can apply it. So ultimately, our aim is to have the CVI where it is something that other people can apply, but we're not quite there yet. But we're working towards it. Scott, do you want to add to that?
I thought that was a comprehensive answer, and apologies, it seemed I disappeared midstream, but I understand John completed my sentence for me, and so that was excellent. There is one other comment that came in on the chat line there, asking the question about the repeatability of the CVI and whether it is dependent upon the individual participants involved. And so in response to that, there is a degree of subjectivity that comes in. Of course, that is the case in any analysis. It's subjective, dependent upon the person who is conducting the analysis. Here, the way that we seek to minimize the subjectivity and optimize the objectivity is to go through and have those clear foundational values defined and very clearly stated, drawing from the foundational document for World Heritage Properties, the Statement of OUV. And with that as the foundation point, we look to the climate science data, the most appropriate and available climate science data. For some locations that is downscaled right to the resolution of the property itself. For other locations, it is a broader scale if the downscaled information is not available. And one other of the ways in which we are able to minimize the subjectivity is to bring in that diverse group of participants. The diverse perspectives that are offered there will help people to not focus only on their one particular area of interest or area of consideration, but rather to expand beyond that through discussion with others. It certainly is an expert consultative model, but it is foundationally based in key outcomes and key structured statements, the values, the climate science predictions, any impacts that have been documented in the past, where thresholds are available, those are implemented. Although we all know that in both ecological and in cultural systems, it's often the case that there are not definitive thresholds that are incorporated. One key aspect of that is for World Heritage Properties, we've noted for many of them, the managers may not have been actively working in the site for an extended period of time, whereas community members have insights, even if they're only anecdotal, that can speak to historical climate variations and climate-related impacts that a manager, even a qualified person, but with lesser experience, might not have the same level of access to. So the value of the less paper qualified, but more experienced people is one of the things that we're able to draw upon through the CVI process.
All right, thank you so much, Scott, John, and Taruna, for your wonderful presentations and the questions to follow up. I'm sure a lot of people will have a lot more questions, and I can see the email on screen right now, cvi.heritage@gmail.com. So for anyone who has further queries, please feel free to follow up with the team here. And for those of you in WI, please feel free to meet Taruna at the C2C Center as well. With that, I would like to quickly hand it back to Dr. Gautam Talukdar for his reflections on the presentations and the questions. Thank you to all. Sir, you're on mute, sir.
Yeah, I am really very happy to have had this, see this wonderful interaction that we had, specifically on the climate vulnerability index. And though we had this kind of vulnerability index for quite some time, this for the first time that we are actually integrating the social side as well as the climatic side together, and that too within the IPCC framework. So that's really a great step forward. as through the discussions, we realize that they have tried out pilot studies, case studies in quite some places, mainly with respect to natural heritage, and we are yet to see its implementation in the cultural heritage side. And hopefully here in India, we should be able to, select a few sites to carry out these tests before, rolling out as a comprehensive guideline for the takers. And we also see that this CVI can be modified to suit even sites other than World Heritage sites. So that also is a great thing. And with this, I would like to specifically thank John, Scott, and Taruna once again, and of course all the participants for this webinar today here, for being with us early morning. And I see quite a few participants are also from abroad, outside India, and really gives me a lot of hope to see that other people are also interested in this particular aspect. So I now hand over to Mr. Neeraj Kakati to offer the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gautam. I am Neeraj from the Wildlife Institute of India Category 2 Center, and it's my privilege to offer this vote of thanks, especially to Taruna for this very interesting talk about the details on the what, whys, and hows of the CVI. I'm sure all of us that have attended this webinar will have a lot of takeaways and explore more opportunities of how this tool can be applied and adapted to our own sites, both World Heritage and beyond. Of course, very significantly, thanks to Dr. John Day and Dr. Scott Heron for your supervision, guidance, and pioneering role in initiating this concept. I'm sure there's more to come on this matter. To all the audience from across the world and the region, thank you for joining us. And of course, very special thanks to all the participants who took the time out and are also further following up in terms of interactions regarding with the CVI. A special acknowledgement to the senior authorities here at the Wildlife Institute, the director, the dean, and as well as the faculty in charge, Dr. Gautam, for allowing to host this webinar and supporting all the matters in this particular thing. And a very strong thank you to the entire team of the Wildlife Institute Category 2 Center for helping to organize the logistics and the technical backstopping for this webinar. Thank you so much, and over to you. Yeah, so thank you, and hope to carry forward this conversation.